Hello, and welcome to Mac Gamecast episode 40. That's right, the big 4-0. I am here today with a bunch of lovely people, all my favorite friends, talk about stuff we'll get to in a moment. And we have Ted. How are you today, sir?
Good, doing well.
Casper, how are you?
Hey, lovely to be here. Back again.
And hooray! And Lily, the national hero, whom I definitely did not slander 10 minutes ago, is also joining us after a long and sad absence. Hooray, hooray, applause, yay.
Hey, finally escaped the field before I go back into it next month.
Yeah, you shared some cool stuff with us. I don't know how off the record that is, but
Nope, it's completely fine, yeah.
Okay,
cool. Doing tank stuff. A lot of fun.
Yes. It was really fun to see those videos. You're transferring to, I don't know what to call it exactly. I was going to say aviation. Thank you. I was going to say Chopper Academy, Flight School. I don't know what it is.
Yep, Flight School. It's basically what it is.
Right. Nice. Back to the OG dream, which I forgot about, then remembered, then forgot, and I was like, what are you talking about? You want to be a chopper pilot? And you're like, I've always wanted to be a chopper pilot, moron. And I'm like, oh, right, now I remember. So the main theme today is going to be RPG games, or perhaps more accurately, CRPG games. What does the C even stand for? I can't remember.
So it's like, it's sort of been backronymmed to be classic. But initially it was computer RPGs because it was the distinction between tabletop RPGs and computer RPGs. But then the field of video game RPGs sort of evolved quite a bit to be very different from the original style of RPG. So it became classic instead. But initially it was just computer RPG.
Interesting. See, I always knew what they were without even knowing what the acronym was. Because of course we have JRPGs, which are the Japanese ones, which denotes a certain style of combat and typically a grandiose story with lots of drama and, flashy visuals. I'm perhaps I'm oversimplifying the JRPG genre. Don't hate me, but I don't. I guess Casper and Lily, you both play JRPGs, so Final Fantasy and stuff.
I don't know what fits each category. I'm not gonna lie.
That's fine.
I think the term JRPG is a bit weird these days because you have a lot of RPGs that come from Japan that don't fit the traditional JRPG format. But are they then not JRPGs, but they come from Japan? Like the Japan part of Japanese RPG doesn't really, we're using it to describe a style of game when it's a country. It's a bit weird sometimes, right?
As far as I know, it mainly denotes the combat, that particular turn order style.
No, definitely. But modern Final Fantasy games don't even really use that system anymore. Final Fantasy 16 is pure action RPG, and Dark Souls is Japanese and stuff like that. So, but they're from Japan, right? And the series is traditionally JRPG in the Final Fantasy case and stuff. I don't know. It gets a bit weird and muddy at times, but yeah. It
does get muddy. And today we're here to wash away the mud with all our enormous wisdom, our collective wisdom. What I find perhaps more pertinent, though, or detailed is, and I was just saying this before the show, is the three of you actually have real D&D tabletop experience, whereas I do not. And I think that's relevant to this discussion, particularly because CRPGs, or classic RPGs, we'll just call them classic RPGs, are rooted in tabletop D&D. All these games, all your Baldur's Gates, Neverwinter Nights, they use, whatever that rule set system is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 edition. Nowadays, they seem to use 5th edition, but for example, Baldur's Gate 3 is based on 5th edition. So that's the relevance. So I find these games slightly difficult to penetrate into from a mechanics or gameplay standpoint because I lack that familiarity. I'm used to complex game systems, but more straightforward ones. So I actually find navigating, I played Baldur's Gate 3 for around 90 minutes or an hour 45. And obviously I understand, there's die rolls for everything, and I understand the basics of what a saving throw is, but how all these systems work. And I'm not used to having my spells you can only use a spell once per long rest. It's what the heck? Why doesn't it just have a 5-turn cooldown or something, like. So this throws me off, and I only understand it on the surface, and I feel like I need to go read a like D&D rulebook and then go back to a game like Baldur's Gate 3.
Yeah, I mean, I've not personally tried Baldur's Gate 3 yet. I was waiting on it to get like its official release, which in a news story, the official release is being moved forward by a month on the PC, maybe the Mac. I assume they're going to release simultaneously.
Oh,
the
really?
console release stays the same, but yeah.
When are they releasing it now?
I think it was October initially. It used to be the exact same month that Starfield. Is that what it's called? The Bethesda
Well, it
one?
still is. Starfield's September 5th.
Okay, but then they moved it forward a month from that on PC.
Oh, okay. All right.
But my understanding was that Baldur's Gate 3 was a lot better than the prior games of this style in introducing newcomers to the mechanics. As I teased a bit last episode, I've been playing a lot of Pathfinder, and what I find to be Pathfinder's biggest weakness is that it has a lot of tutorial text to try and introduce you to a bunch of things, but it still expects you to know a lot of the mechanics from the tabletop game, just, to play well, and to understand why some things work and some things don't and such. I hadn't played Pathfinder, but I have played enough D&D to where I could pretty easily understand what was going on still, with needing to look up a few things still. But with Pathfinder Kingmaker, which is the one I've been playing, some things are just very obscure if you don't know what's going on. I do think it is a genuine weakness here, but it also gives it some charm that it adheres to the tabletop mechanics, but they definitely should be better at onboarding people who aren't familiar with it in these style of games.
Isn't the latest one Wrath of the Righteous?
Yes, Wrath of the Righteous has, yeah.
Is that any like better in that regard? Do you know? Like maybe better at onboarding?
I've not tried it yet. It's on my list of things to try after Kingmaker. But from what I've heard, they've made improvements in UI to make things more clear. But I don't know if they've got better tutorial text or something. But at least the UI should be more clear. Because they're like the UI in Kingmaker is fine, but there are some things where even I am sitting there like, I know I want to do this thing, I don't know how. And I had to Google it and figure it out. Like things like when you take a rest, if you're in the overworld map, you can assign someone to hunt and you can take a rest without having rations because you just hunt the food you need while you rest, right? But if you're in a dungeon or something, if you want to rest, you need to use rations. Every single time I hit rest, the button just went, your people aren't going to rest. You can just pass time. And I didn't understand why, because I had enough rations. It said you need 6 rations, you have 7 or something like that. I didn't get it. You had to click the button that said you have 7 rations, and it didn't look like a button at all.
Okay.
It's almost like the DM was like, well, check your sheet. Do you have the rations? And you never got the message,
yeah, something like that. It was, there's a lot of small things like that in Kingmaker, but all in all, it's very, very good and solid and well built. Like I'm very impressed with how big and how well made everything is, given that it's at least partially crowdfunded through Kickstarter, and as far as I've understood, Owlcat's first game, though a lot of the people may have prior experience in the industry and stuff, but it's very impressive.
Speaking of Owlcat again, and I know Lily and I are the big Warhammer fans here. So they're also making Rogue Trader, which already has a Mac beta. I don't know if that's advertised, but if you go and buy it off their website, you get a Mac version as well. It'll be on Steam later, so the same Steam Blaze stuff. Once again, I played around 90 or so minutes, an hour 45 of Rogue Trader, which is really interesting. Anyone familiar or unfamiliar with Warhammer lore, well, the Rogue Traders are, much like their name, they're basically traders, but not traitors as in traitor legions, but they have a wide mandate to explore, trade. They do a bit of fighting and espionage. They're kind of like a multi-role, like a whole bunch of things bundled into one. But most importantly, they have like a special license or edict from like the Emperor or the Imperium of Man that like lets them run around and do what they want and kind of be apolitical and this and that. Maybe Lily, maybe you have something to comment on this because I've been playing it a bit. Because in Rogue Trader, the story's very 40K, and you end up soon enough in command of, the ship. It's of a Rogue Trader ship. But first you're serving under someone else, but all this, betrayal happens, typical 40K stuff. Oh no, there's cultists and heretics and oh no's and all that stuff. But later on, I know from the promo materials and the demos and stuff, like you can recruit a Sister of Battle, which I know is one of your favorite things. But more importantly, you can also recruit, I think, an ultra. Is it a Grey Wolf or an Ultramarine? You can get a Space Marine. I forget exactly which chapter. So what I'm wondering is, from like a D&D tabletop term standpoint, how do you balance like having just regular humans in your party, commissars and like a Rogue Trader captain, alongside like a Sister of Battle or an Ultramarine, like. Because the Sister of Batter, Sister of Batter, they make really good pancakes.
Wow, we're already back to the kitchen jokes. Goddamn.
That was unintentional. I brace as I stumble over my words.
First you slander my name, and now you're saying that Sisters of Battle just need to go back to the kitchen. What's next?
Well, no, that she's got like a field, a field grill. She just like grills them on her armor or something. Like just pops out like an arm mod. No,
but like, that would actually be useful.
Yeah, but how do you balance like the power level of these characters in a party from a D&D standpoint? Because lore wise, they don't add up. Some of them are just way stronger than the others. So I'm curious. I know you haven't played the game, but like you've participated in a number of D&D campaigns. I know in Warhammer as well. So do you have like any thoughts on that? Like how it could possibly be balanced? Like how do these couple characters not just like steamroll everyone?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't played Rogue Trader, but I've seen like a couple of videos and whatnot. But I think really at the end of the day, when it comes to characters like that in any, genre of RPG, either like the balancing comes down to either you just don't balance it. That character is just going to steamroll everyone. And there's some sort of narrative reasoning for them not being present in a certain area, like, oh, they went off to go chase these chaos guys, or they're, he's keeping your flank clear or something like that, something to write them off, or they're going to give some sort of limitation in a good narrative. That limitation makes sense within the confines of a story. Like he's recovering from a wound that's going to take him a while, or you kind of found him out in the middle of nowhere. He doesn't have all of his armor, all of his weapons, so he's not as effective as a normal Space Marine would be. There are ways to make it work, and even in Pathfinder, like fantasy style campaigns, right? Like the enforced character limitation is a go-to for a lot of GMs. I know that for certain, but I don't know exactly how they will do it in Rogue Trader, but it'll definitely be interesting to see, and I think it can be done, and it'll bring that much more 40K to Rogue Trader, which, to be fair, 40K is a very it tries to be like super super serious, but it's honestly a little silly, right? Like once you pass a certain level of destructiveness and warfare, it's like the what is it, the Dragon Ball thing, right? Where it's like, oh, you beat this big bad, you beat Frieza, who's this powerful. Well, haha, this person's twice as strong, and it's like, it doesn't really mean anything anymore. So
yeah, definitely.
I've found that my enjoyment for 40K grows, or rather has grown, the moment I stopped looking too much into the lore.
I also think it's important to note here that there's while these games can take the systems from tabletop games, they often do change them a bit, because there is a big difference between the context of a tabletop RPG and the context of a video game. Where if you're sitting at a table with 5 people or whatever, there's a lot more to it than just fighting. And while you want everybody to have times where they can shine, give them all a moment, it doesn't all have to be in combat related things. I like playing bards. I've got played several bards in my campaigns, and I don't mind that when it comes time to battle, I'm not the strongest on the team. I'm not the one who deals all the damage. I'm not the one who can take all the hits and so on, because I have fun with the role playing parts in that bit, right? And I can still do important things in combat, like buff people or whatever. But there's more to it than that, especially in the context of a tabletop setting, where my time to shine then could be when we reach a city and I have to do performance to impress people or whatever, right? If you're in the context of a video game, they may try and have a lot of these non-combat moments to shine as well to balance out the strength of the party. But with a lot of games, there's just going to be more focus on the combat mechanics, and that's fine as well. But that means you can tweak the systems here and there a bit to make it fit better for that, and a lot of them do. So there's also you when you're sitting at a table, you almost want fewer dice rolls than on a video game, right? Because if you have an encounter every 5 steps, you will get a bit tired of that if you have to roll dice all the time at a table. But a video game can do all the math for you behind the scenes, so it's fine to have a lot more combat encounters, maybe with fewer encounters per fewer enemies per turn or something like that. But just doing a lot more of that, which may also mean that to make facilitate that, they give you a spell slot or 2 more or something, because they can do all the math for you, so you don't need to sit there as long over the nitty-gritty math of the dice rolls and adding your bonuses and all that. Which also means they often go more crazy with giving you a lot more bonuses and stuff to, make the numbers higher, because they'll worry about doing all the math for you and stuff. So there are some big differences between the formats that you can take advantage of when you design around it.
Right. I just dropped a photo of one of the stat screens. This is just one of many for Rogue Trader. So it's pretty extensive. Ted and also Lily, what, once again, you guys coming more from that D&D, I don't know if to call it background, but, as people who play both tabletop and computer RPGs, kind of what's your experience or maybe even preference there? Maybe starting with Ted.
Yeah, I have to really agree with Casper. It seems to me that most of the computer-based ones are combat-centric, for lack of a better word. It's it's all about that. It's all about the motion, and when you're playing on a tabletop, it's a lot more of the thinking and a lot more of the mechanics of different people doing things different ways, and that's one thing I don't know. I honestly don't know if there's a computer-based role-playing game where you can actually have a multiple players. Where I noticed that we were talking about Pathfinder. I think that's just a single-person player, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the dynamics of 4 or 5 people in a room, all with different attitudes and feelings, gets lost. And that's actually one of the more fun aspects of it, at least from a DM standpoint, which I used to do years, centuries ago. People could come up with amazing thoughts, and if you're keep your mind open, you can twist what they're doing to pull more interest into the game. But you don't see that in the computer-based ones. There's none of this flying on this, coming up with ideas on the fly type of thing. But nevertheless, I mean, and I don't think, I guess people who play tabletop are probably a little bit more into, I don't know, I don't know what the word for it is, interaction with other people. Mm-hmm. Whereas in, the computer games, you can tend to be like me by myself. That's one of the reasons why I like to play MMOs, is because there's other people you can, and sometimes it's really stupid stuff, but a lot of times it's good. So that's my thought on it. So
Just a quick comment on that before we move on to Lily. So I think either Neverwinter Night 1 or 2, one of them, maybe both, I don't know, did actually have a multiplayer mode. But
yeah,
I think it exactly. I think it's the only one I can think of that had that, but that was a thing. And they even had like a be your own DM kind of thing where you could make maps and adventures for other people and stuff. So
that is true. That is true. I didn't think to mention that, but that was one. That was such a unique game. It almost doesn't fit in the role. Yeah, but that was. I actually played it online with 2 other people. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's true that it was uncommon, at least back in the day. Almost all of them were single player, and only, I think of the old school ones, Neverwinter Nights was the only multiplayer one, prominent one. Maybe there's some little indie spin-off thing, and I just don't know about it. In more modern times, you'd have to go to like Larian Studios, Divinity Original Sin 1 and 2, but those aren't game. Those aren't. I wouldn't call them. Those aren't CRPGs though. They're just turn-based tactical RPGs, in my opinion, because they streamline most of the D&D stuff out of the game. There's still some complex systems at play, but it's like way more straightforward. But they do have multiplayer.
This is where it gets muddy because I would still label them CRPGs, even if they don't. Even if they don't use all the systems. But yeah,
that's fair. They're CRPGs. They're just not the rule set. Like, here's a fair distinction. It's more of a classic RPG. It's just the rule set is not rooted in D&D whatever X edition.
Sure.
And there's no front end. There's nothing off. There's you wouldn't look at skills or this or that. There's nothing about dice rolls. There's no chances to hit. There's not like a wild range of attributes and races and sub-races and classes and feats. It doesn't use any of that. You have like attributes, talents, skills. That's it. It's pretty straightforward. Yeah. Although it's still, you still have like 200 plus spells and over 12 different, I think, skill schools. And, the game's fairly deep. I don't want to sell it short. And you can get up to all sorts of shenanigans in the world that are like not obvious. And, player creativity is important. But the D&D rule set takes that to another level, like several steps beyond it. But so you gain that like crazy amount of freedom, but then maybe the price you pay as well, there's sort of this layer of accessibility you have to like get over or learn to like really get into that experience. But Lily, did you want to comment at all about maybe your D&D experiences versus computer gaming experiences or anything like that?
Yeah, no, I think everyone else really kind of hit on it already. It's that human aspect is the biggest difference, because with especially when you factor in balancing, right? Because if you have a player that you trust to be more focused on narrative and not just, oh look, I have this stat block that lets me one hit everything, so no one else feels like they're useful in combat. Like a good example is one character I've had for a long time. She's actually like an angel in disguise that is she just pretends to be a paladin. And her whole deal is that she's like a part of an angelic faction that sort of guides the mortal races and make sure they're doing the right stuff and not summoning demons and all the good stuff. So in combat, she could very easily like destroy most of the things that we fight. But because I have a fake out character sheet, and because the DM trusts me to just like, not just bring out the real character sheet and say, hey, look, I'm actually CR20 and get screwed, everyone. Like, it allows for that really, really interesting story, and then led to this huge reveal. And it's like, it's this amazing character concept that you can use, but you have to have trust for it. And that was just an example. There's lots of cases where people have characters that are stronger in some areas, not so much in others, and then you trust the player to make that balance. But when you're playing a video game, when you're not, there's no other player, it's just the computer, right? And then there's different levels, right? There's some RPGs or CRPGs where you have control over all the characters. There are some where you only have control over your own character, and the others are are computer managed, and you can interact with them. You can change their stats, but they still do their own thing. And depending on how that goes, it can really affect the narrative and the flow. And so I think not having that human aspect, it's a boon in some ways for storytelling, just because it allows for a more predictable path. And so you can have a fully controlled computer game because you don't need to rely on characters doing something that the story doesn't really anticipate. But then on the flip side, you lose a lot of that as well. You lose that player balance, like the artificial balancing, in a sense, of how someone would play a character.
Right.
And I guess it kind of takes away from replayability as well, because the first time you go through that game, after that what those characters are.
Mhm.
You can't replay the same campaign with different characters because those are the characters. That's what is there.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah, it's inherently just a very different format, and it's almost kind of impressive that the two very different formats can use the same systems and get away with it so well. Like, because they are so different, right? But it somehow works still. But like on that front of the dynamism and how characters are different and stuff, like obviously a CRPG can never reach the human level of being dynamic to whatever everyone is doing and stuff. But if you'll excuse me for geeking out about Pathfinder yet again, I think that's something that they've actually achieved to a surprisingly good degree, given that it is all pre-programmed, where all of the characters, so you control all of the characters in combat, but outside of that, all of the characters have their own opinions about everything and comments on things you do and gives you suggestions and everything. But it's so dynamic that characters can choose not to be a part of your team anymore if they disagree too much with what you do. And like even little things like my barbarian loves her sword. I can't change her sword. If I try and give her another sword, she just goes, "Nah, I don't like it." But that's like a simple little thing that is actually combat. One of the things where you usually have control over them, but it's just such a big part of her character that she's attached to that sword that she refuses. You can give her additional swords, but you can't take that one away from her.
That's good. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think Divinity Original Sin walks that line pretty well, in my opinion. Obviously, there's a fixed story with like certain acts and certain bosses, but the freedom, well, for one, you can play a custom character, and there's a bunch of different characters and races and skills and combos, so you could have a like wildly different combat experience, like nothing alike your other. Certain major choices will remain kind of the same, because it's true, this isn't a true like freeform DM. You watch a little Critical Role, for example. I watched mostly the wrap-ups, and they're like, and Matt Mercer, the main guy, is like, yeah, well, if you went over here, I had this whole other storyline planned in this direction, but you never went there, so it didn't happen, and this. So the video games kind of have that to an extent. We're like, oh, well, if you make maybe major choice A, it unlocks like these side quests, or this thing, or B, well, then it kind of goes over there. But that's where the replay value can come in done well. You can make a different major choice and be like, wow, maybe I'm fighting for a different side, or maybe I unlocked new items or characters I didn't realize, or maybe I chose to betray someone instead of help them, or blah, blah, blah. Some games do it better than others. I think Larian Studios does it very well. I replayed Divinity Original Sin 1 like 2 or 3 times because it was pretty good. Divinity Original Sin 2 I actually didn't like as much and only played it through once. Not to say there wasn't replay value. There was. But I didn't feel as compelled by the game. And I think this goes back to what Lily was saying, is that Divinity Original Sin 1 was really only designed for 2 players, I think, in the multiplayer. You could technically do 4, but the extra characters were NPCs recruited to the party. The game was really kind of a duo game for 1 to 2 at its heart. Divinity Original Sin 2 opened that up to be a full 4-player game with all sorts of like player shenanigans in mind. And I'm not saying it's a bad story or a worse game for it. Just for my preferences, I preferred this sort of, I guess, both. It's odd because I think the story in 1 was both tighter and more whimsical at the same time. And in Divinity Original Sin 2 was a lot more freeform because of kind of the stuff you guys have been talking about. More player agency, more randomness. So like the story has to allow for the broader like player actions. So it's really, I think at that point it just boils down to a matter of preference. What kind of player are you? What kind of stories do you enjoy? It's definitely true. Video games skew combat heavy, even when they have good stories. For example, once again, going back to the Larian Studio games, I think they're great. Baldur's Gate 3, from what I've played and seen, seems to have a really compelling story as well. I mean, it helps. It has like top-notch visuals, like camera angles, voice acting, animations. Everything's like incredible, like very impressive. So it really draws you in. But nonetheless, it has a compelling story. It's not a spoiler to say you end up, you just wake up on a mind flayer ship, and you've got a little tadpole thing implanted in your head. That like wiggles around and it's going to kill you, but it also like gives you some powers. But then it comes under attack by, I don't know, dragons or some shit. So the whole thing's like going down in flames and you're running around trying to escape. It's a very epic opening. But then, much like Divinity Original Sin 2, it kind of has these origin characters you can pick who have like predetermined backgrounds and traits and personalities, or you can just make a custom character. And then, of course, you meet those other origin characters as other major characters in the story, and you can have them join your party and so on and so forth. But yeah, for me, I like the idea of this sort of, how would you say it? The story complexity a game rooted in D&D rules can bring, but it's the combat complexity that I haven't wrapped my head around yet. So I've just like totally fumbled my way through it and failed a lot because not understanding the systems. This was a very early build. I tried this probably like 2 years ago at this point. Maybe even more. It was like when it first came out. So I don't think they had much in the way of tutorials yet or anything. Right. Now I'm sure they do. But to be fair, the UI is pretty complex. Like there's an enormous tab of like, oh, here's like 20 different actions you can do over here. And here's all your spell books. No, it's like your short rest stuff and your long rest stuff and this and that. And I'm just like, oh my God, what is all this?
I'll say this. As much as I absolutely adore the Pathfinder game, I don't think it's a good starting point. So I do think you should get familiar with Baldur's Gate 3 when it comes out. And then if you really if you like that, then the Pathfinder games are great too. But just based on the systems that they're built on top of, I haven't played Baldur's Gate 3, but Baldur's Gate 3 is based off of D&D 5e, as you mentioned earlier, which itself is a simplification of prior D&D systems that put more emphasis on role-playing than the combat and all that. So being based off of that, I expect it to be a lot simpler than something like Pathfinder, which is based on or evolved from D&D 3.5. So it's a lot more nitty-gritty about the systems. One thing that tricked me up a lot early on in Pathfinder is you have all these like bonuses to things, right? But bonuses of the same type don't stack, which means that there's going to be a lot of your bonuses where every single time you're like, should I use this spell to enhance this thing on this character? You go in and check, do they already have something of the same type of bonus? If they do, this doesn't actually add anything, even though the spell says it adds +2, but they already have a +2 from morale bonus or whatever. And there's just so many of these things to keep track of. The game initially shipped as real-time with pause, which I think a lot of the old CRPGs did. Like, I think Neverwinter Night was the same and stuff. I much prefer playing it in turn-based mode, which fortunately is a thing it has now. And the turn-based mechanics are, really solidly built, given that it was initially designed around real-time with pause, similar to, also Dragon Age Origin and stuff. But I recommend the turn-based system. It gives you more time to... Well, I mean, you always have infinite time to consider things because it's real-time with pause otherwise. But just that structure of this person acts, this person acts, this person acts. Because even if you play real-time with pause, it still goes on the turn system where every single character has 6 seconds per turn and they have initiative order and stuff. So right. You might as well do it turn-based, I think. But yeah.
Yeah. I've never liked real-time with pause games. They've always annoyed me because it's tough to play them in true real time. But then when you pause, it feels weird because it isn't actually turn-based. It feels like you're cheating, like you have a time stop skill. To me, there's always been a dissonance of like the gameplay mechanic. I understand why people do it, but I'm like, just make the game fully viable in real time or make it a turn-based game. Why do this awkward mishmash? Anyway, it's never been for me, but maybe I guess some people
I agree.
like
It was actually the discovery that I found out that Pathfinder had a proper turn-based mode that got me to buy it, because otherwise I was like, I like all the other things, but I really don't like that it's real time with pause. And then I was like, there's a turn-based mode. I am getting that.
Nice. Speaking of this narrative focus, I wanted to talk a bit about Rogue Trader because it opens up with quite a lot of story, which is great because Lily was pointing out rightly earlier, the less she looks at like 40k lore, the more kind of she enjoys it. I would agree with that, knowing some 40k nerds at my local game store. And, you know, when they're playing sometimes it's like, oh, well, this army can do this and this guy can do that. And, you know, it's just like, oh, my God, you know. And, well, they should be able to do this and they should be able to do that. And they have like 10 pages of stat sheets to back it up. And it's just like, anyway, whatever. I think that's where the game kind of falls apart. But where, it, like Lily, when I asked earlier about like balancing, this is where it can shine. You can take this, you know, wide array of power level characters, or, you know, maybe someone's, you know, way higher or lower based on race or technology or spiritual or chaotic power, or whatever it may be, because all of that's in 40k. You have, you know, for lack of a better word, light and dark side powers. Light and dark side, not to make it sound like Star Wars, but broadly speaking, that's accurate in 40k. I guess you have people in the middle, like the Tau or the Adeptus Mechanicus, who are all about the machine gods, machine spirits, but whatever. But yeah, it's very story heavy, and I enjoyed that. It wasn't just like, here's your combat. At some point, combat came up, but it was a good 45 minutes, maybe an hour into the game, I think. And you did mention Pathfinder being nitty gritty, and I was overwhelmed by Rogue Trader's thingy because, as I already said, I'm not familiar with any depth on these type of systems. And Rogue Trader seemed way more nitty gritty than like Baldur's Gate, and I was already like struggling with that. If I put the time, I could learn, but I didn't want to take bunch of time to learn the game. I just wanted to jump in and check out this 40k RPG game. Mm-hmm. So it hit all the notes I wanted with story and atmosphere and setting. Writing was excellent. The combat I played was cool, very 40k. But yeah, like, oh, you leveled up, and here's like 10 level up screens and things you have to read and learn about. I'm just like, oh my God, help. And there's all these multipliers and percentages and this and that. And I'm just like, okay, cool. But I have no idea what this is. I'm not trying to slander Owlcat here. They have a bunch of external links, like, oh, here's guides. It's not in the game yet because it's in it's not even in beta. It's in alpha. So they have write-ups on it, I think on Steam or maybe on a Google Drive or something. It is there. But I was just in the mood to demo it, not like, okay, I'll take an hour or two to go read all this stuff.
Right.
Naturally, I'm sure the final game will walk you through it and pop up some blah, blah, blah. But yeah, but this narrative thing, I did appreciate that in, for example, the Divinity games, if you put a lot of points in the persuasion skill, which I always did, you could actually talk your way past a lot of fights. Mm-hmm. The only problem I have with that is, and I think this is something that perhaps Baldur or truly D&D based games might fix, is in Divinity games, you only get XP for completing quests or killing things. So talking your way past a huge fight is actually of no benefit to you XP-wise. And in the Divinity games, all XP is finite in the sense that there's no way to farm or grind. So you're basically always incentivized to fight because that's how you level up. So not to mention killing like elites and special guys. They usually have unique items and stuff. Although maybe you could pickpocket them if you have high stealth and pickpocket. But that's what always bugged me is you got 0 XP for persuasion. I dumped like 5, a ton of points into persuasion, talked my way out of crazy situations that I had no right to do. And then it's just like, okay, here's no reward. And I'm like, what? Then I usually turned around and picked the fight anyway. Yeah. Because I wanted the XP.
No, I can say with confidence that Pathfinder does give you XP for using your skills. Whether it's persuasion or it's disarming a trap or, climbing a wall, whatever. If you do something that requires us characters to do something impressive, they reward it. Right.
So I'm sure Baldur's Gate would do that. Because I also enjoy... I don't know if it definitely wasn't always true. I mean, I've always enjoyed a good story because I like to read a lot of books. But I think as I've gotten slightly older, not that I'm that old, but I mean, Lily likes to call me old man because I am compared to her. But
because you are an old man.
I am 37. But I definitely I wouldn't want a pure like narrative RPG game. I guess that's not entirely true. I did play that little space one with the dice, but that was like a light RPG. That was more inspired from board games rather than tabletop games. But it didn't have any combat. It was just sort of exploration, adventure, story stuff. But that was also like a quote unquote bite-sized game. I think it took me 6 to 8 hours to play. I don't think I would want to play like a 40, 50, 60 hour, whatever, 100-hour RPG that was like all story, no combat.
What about Disco Elysium? Because that's basically that, right?
That's true. That's true. That's such a unique game that it pulled me in. I think if it was done in a more like style of what we're talking about, let's call it a D&D game. Maybe it's because these games are often set in fantasy or sci-fi worlds that I have a certain expectation of combat. Maybe it's that. But Disco Elysium is you're just this everyday. I mean, okay, it's still a fictional world, but it's quote unquote the real world with more or less real world rules, barring a few certain things. So I guess for me, it's a matter of expectation.
Right. But Disco Elysium is like in a lot of ways similar to traditional CRPGs, and you know,
it is.
It clearly borrows a lot from that tabletop RPG heritage.
It does. I think it's really the setting and the theme that changes my expectations, basically. And they make all interactions so entertaining. I think that's also it. Like, we can't deny as gamers there's a certain thrill of combat, you know, especially with RPGs. You know, you often have to really use your head, unless maybe you have an OP character. You can't just force your way through. You have to get creative or clever, maybe set up ambushes and, you know, build your characters to have some synergy and so on, you know, which makes it fun, or combo your spells and blah, blah, blah. There's a certain thrill there. That's hard to deny. But basically, you know, what makes a game fun? Of course, that's a broad question, and it really ultimately very subjective. We could all probably find one game where like, well, that isn't fun for me, but for us, it was super fun. You know, we've been doing some of our favorite games of all time, but we've had some overlap there. Still got to do some with Lily, though, if she ever has more time for that. But what I'm trying to say is Disco Elysium made sort of every interaction like absurd, bizarre, hilarious, weird, unexpected. So just basically the whole experience of the game was always giving you some kind of like fun feedback from whatever you did. You know, you just wander around and pick up bottles or whatever, and the game would like something strange would happen. And I think that's what, because it what would you call it? It like personified all your emotions and thoughts. It was so outrageous in a good way. So your typical CRPG, you know, it has, you know, anyone worth its salt will have cool characters with interesting flaws and backstories and goals and ambitions and friendships and rivalries and all this kind of stuff, because that's what makes it fun. It lets you chew on it as a player and interact with it. But, you know, you have, I forget your partner's name in Disco Elysium, the cop guy, Kim. Something.
Kim.
Yeah, Kim. But nonetheless, you basically embody to an extreme the character with your thoughts and your cabinet and your this and your that. And so CRP, like, that's what makes it so interesting. Just to focus on that narrative and that experience of the character, because it's so visceral and so detailed. You know, I haven't seen like a game that has like combat and narrative do that, because, well, I don't think it could. I think Disco Elysium, to its credit, excluded. I mean, I think there's one or two situations where you can like shoot or punch a guy or something, but it's like super uncommon. It's not and
it's not really combat. It's just like an event, right?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, it's an event. Yeah, a standoff with the Union guys or the docks or something. So once again, I think the setting and theme is important, but also the fact that it has all these systems to make anything you do in the game entertaining. Whereas a traditional CRPG, even a really well done story with cool characters and backgrounds, I think Divinity does this pretty well. Baldur's Gate 3 has a whole cast of seemingly also very interesting characters. Rogue Trader also seems very interesting. I'm sure the Pathfinder games are good. You know, the old, I don't remember now because I only played a demo of the old Neverwinter Nights. But, you know, I hear great things about the Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 and Icewind Dale and I don't know what others. But to me, those games don't offer encompassing enough experience around of the narrative to stand on that alone. Whereas a game like Disco Elysium does because of all these other facets to it. That's my
Sure. I get you on that front. Yeah, I kind of agree. But it's really just a matter of focus, right? Because these games also do have combat in them, they've partially focused on combat. But if they didn't, then they would have focused on all these other things to make all the other systems more engaging. So
that's fair. That's fair. Right. Like, let's say, well, not a Baldur's Gate game because that has expectations of combat, but let's say you're in, it's kind of like what they did with Tales from the Borderlands, if anyone here ever played that. You're in the Borderlands universe, but instead of being, the epic vault hunter with guns, you're just like some random schmuck trying to make their way in the Borderlands universe. So, but it made a really compelling story, and it was very fun. It was a very highly rated game. And it actually eventually became canon in the universe and stuff, so that was cool. But now I wonder, I think the way I would actually play one of these kinds of games in a fantasy or sci-fi setting is you would have, I don't know, maybe you're just some hapless bard or whatever, making your way in the world, or maybe you could pick a few things, but you would have to exclude all the like combat classes or maybe combat orientated races or something.
So in Pathfinder Kingmaker, you so I don't think it's a spoiler to say this because it's kind of in the title. You become a baron or a baroness and start ruling a barony or a kingdom eventually, I guess. I don't yeah. And it's a major system in the game, but it's also one of many. And you can turn it off entirely if you don't like it. But it has a lot of interesting systems in it where you can pick who's your advisors for certain areas of ruling your kingdom. You have like these little mini city builder kind of things, not, city skyline or anything, just, pick some buildings you want in a village and stuff. And events happen all the time where you can pick advisors to solve certain crises or whatever that can happen. People come to speak to you in your throne room and you react to what they say. And frankly, this system could, in my opinion, be an entire game in its own right. And it's just this little system in Kingmaker. It's almost impressive again that, it's in there as just a thing. And there's many other things. And it's so well done that it almost could be a game in its own right. But I think if they had focused almost exclusively on that and made that a game, that could also be fun and good in itself. So I think if you were to do something like that, a system like that could be an interesting angle to take as well, because there is a lot of interesting conflict resolution, both between what happens in your kingdom as a whole, the people that come to visit you in your throne room, and how your advisors may conflict in opinion about what you do, what each of them do independently, and the direction of the kingdom as a whole and stuff.
Right. That's fair. And that's, I guess, also why a number of these like city type simulator games or Crusader and so on are very compelling because there's all this intrigue and management. That's true. I shouldn't, dismiss that idea either. And I just wasn't thinking of it. I think that can be compelling. I forget the name of the game because I'm so bad with names, but somebody did a year or two ago make the whole game. And it is, you're just a king in a throne room or queen, I forget which. And that's the whole game is people come to your throne room, you make decisions and advisors, and it goes by like day or year or whatever. And that's the whole game. It's just that throne room mechanic.
There was a thing like that, maybe what you're thinking of, but it's a lot simpler. That was called Reigns. But that was like almost Tinder with this thing where you had like swipe left and swipe right for the events to, do the thing.
No, this is some indie type game, pixel game a year or two back. Decently popular. I forget the name. I don't think it was on Mac though.
Okay.
But it was like a similar idea. Yeah, basically how to make a game compelling without combat. I guess you could even call combat a crutch. It still takes talent and effort to make engaging combat, especially over the course of a long game, and not just like, okay, this is fun for half an hour or an hour. It's like, okay, how do you make it fun for a whole game? That's also requires lots of skill and everything. Just as making a story compelling for so long also requires its own skill. It's true. I have played some more narrative heavy board games that have minimal combat, like Tainted Grail, for example, which is like dark Arthurian legend stuff. It's probably like 80% story, 20% combat, roughly. So that the story remained compelling through the whole game, but honestly, around 2/3 the way through the game, the combat got so repetitive, I started skipping it. Other than a couple like boss encounters, I literally just started skipping every combat encounter because it wasn't fun anymore. But the story was really cool. The exploration was really cool. That's what I wanted to keep playing. So, yeah, I feel like that game basically shouldn't just have any combat at all. But that's a board game. It's neither a video game or a D&D game. It's all cards. Resolution. There's no dice. Anyway, it was also open world, semi-open world. So, yeah, Lily, any thoughts on all this, or do you prefer? Okay, here's a question to you, Lily. Do you prefer playing more on the video game side? Do you prefer video games that have more of a D&D heavy focus or rule set, or would you rather kind of keep that on the tabletop and just play, your Mass Effects and your whatever, more games that are quote unquote RPGs, but they're not classic RPGs?
I think it depends on the game. It doesn't feel fair to compare an RPG like Mass Effect, which is, not. It's more of a shooter with story elements, right?
Right, yeah.
The story is fantastic, but the core of the gameplay is shooting things, and
right,
majority of the game, you're running around shooting things. That is the game. If you were to cut all the story out of Mass Effect, would it still be a good game? Probably not. I don't think it would. But then you have games like Call of Duty, which is you don't need a story there. That is the gameplay loop, and that has its own charm to it. For CRPGs, though, it definitely benefits from having a fixed mechanic, and it doesn't necessarily have to be D&D. Like Rogue Trader, for example, it's not actually based on D&D, which I guess it's based on a system which is based on D&D, but oh god, what was the name of that?
Pathfinder?
No, there was a tabletop RPG for 40K. I think it's actually just called Warhammer 40K Roleplay.
I think I've heard of that, so I think that is just what it's called. Yeah.
Yeah, but if you look at Rogue Trader's character screen, for example, right? You have weapon skill, ballistic skill, strength, toughness, agility, intelligence, perception, willpower, fellowship, instead of your Pathfinder, your Pathfinder D&D, strength, dex, con, intellect, wisdom, charisma, right? It's got a different system, and that's that fits for that because that's the genre, that's what it was made for. So it doesn't just have to be D&D, but fixed systems are definitely beneficial to CRPGs, and to an extent JRPGs. I think they kind of have their own thing going, but it's got that internal rule system that lets you kind of play tabletop games without playing tabletop games. For a casual game that is very, very story focused, those have huge benefits. Especially if you don't have time to have a tabletop group. You can't. There's no group in the area. You can't find a group, or you just don't have time. That still gives you a good story, and at least for a single playthrough, it's a lot of fun. I've not replayed any RPGs. I don't think there is an RPG I do want to replay, which is Wrath of the Righteous. We were talking about that earlier, just because it has those different paths.
Mm-hmm.
Not every game does that, right? I think, 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 I what was that other RPG? You were talking about it earlier, with the skipping certain things with certain encounters by using persuasion.
Divinity Original Sin.
Divinity, yes,
Yeah.
thank you. I'm sorry, I've been out of the gameplay loop.
No worries.
Divinity. I did not have an urge to replay it, and I know a lot of people love replaying Divinity, and I think the multiplayer aspect. If I had a multiplayer group to play it with, I think I would replay it. I think that definitely helps it. But the single player, I just didn't feel the urge to replay it because I didn't feel there were those momentous branches like what Wrath of the Righteous has.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think that's accurate.
I think to kind of sum it up, like, yes, it is very advantageous in the right circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense. I guess what I'm excited to see as game development, graphics are peaking a little bit. They're not as like next gen jumps as they used to be. So, I'm hoping, game devs, whether it's indies or otherwise. Larian used to be an indie studio. They're not anymore. They're an independent studio, but they're not an indie studio. That's important to note. But that people can, I still like a good looking game, but what I really like is polished gameplay. And I do, I look forward in the next few years, even the evolutions from, say, Divinity Original Sin 2 to Baldur's Gate 3. They're not the same game, but there's some clear inspirations, like the origin character system is passed over to Baldur's Gate 3, and I don't know what else, but maybe just that.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just talking to a friend of mine, Mike, who is a D&D guy. He's a 40K guy. He's a board game guy. He video games on the side. But he's just playing Baldur's Gate 3. But then he's like, okay, I want to wait for a release. And then he went back to play Divinity Original Sin 2. And he was kind of complaining to me a little bit like, well, I don't know if I like this game as much and this and that. And I'm like, well, Baldur's Gate 3 also has benefited from 5-6 years more of game development and polish and more different systems.
Mm-hmm.
Though I think the dice rolling, the more like D&D heavy rule set appeals to him, I think, coming from 40K, where he's used to like stat sheets and rolls for everything. So that sort of naturally appeals to him. But I do think it's just, 5 years from now, be cool if we're all still here chatting to each other. Will we look back at Baldur's Gate 3 and be like, oh yeah, that game did this thing cool, but now they're doing all these other cool things? Or maybe what's the next evolution of a game like Disco Elysium? There's so many Disco Elysium spinoffs like in development right now. I don't mean official spinoffs. I mean copycats, for lack of a better word. There's one set in Australia. There's one in like steampunk fantasy London, where you can play like a minotaur and a this and a that. But just to use practically like copy paste the same systems from Disco Elysium, but of course their own story. So I don't want to see copycats. I want to see evolution.
I don't think like using the same gameplay systems for something like the Disco Elysium thing. I don't really think matters. It's similar to how, like, as we mentioned before, Baldur's Gate 1, 2, Neverwinter Night, they were all based on the same D&D version. They all had the same gameplay mechanics effectively. But what made them different was the environment, the art, the story, all that, right? And I think Disco Elysium systems, like, what makes Disco Elysium good is not its systems. Like, it has fine systems. What makes it good is its story, it's its world, and all that, right? So
that's true.
If another studio wants to basically try and take that gameplay system and make something different with it, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Well, I mean, you maybe the legal department of the Disco Elysium people would argue. I don't know, but evolution, progress, evolution of game design, all that's fine. But there's also nothing wrong with just making a new story with a product that basically exists, right? We've done it a lot in the past where, sometimes there's big evolutions where we like discover that doing it this way works really well for video games or something, but sometimes you also just gotta make something cool with a lot of artistic inspiration, and it doesn't need to be revolutionary.
Especially if it's a proven system that people already like. Especially if you're another indie game dev, I can see the appeal, especially you want to sort of maybe offload some of the risk. And the risk is then in your own, what you just said, the creative side, like, oh, what are my creative merits or our creative merits? Can we stand on the strength of that within this template, that someone else already established? That's not unreasonable. Maybe it's just my preference. I'm really, for whatever reason, in the last year or two in my gaming, and I mean both like board games and video games, I basically just feel like I just want new experiences rather than playing the same old. It's why I've stopped playing all the like quote unquote endless games I used to just bury my head in for years on end. Because I don't just want to keep playing the same thing. I want something, different and newer, interesting. So I think that's just not. I think now that I'm saying it out loud,
Sure,
it's coming from me, right? Like where I'm at right now in my entertainment preferences. That's it.
That also makes good sense. But even within that, I don't think something like the Disco Elysium system is tired yet. It is, it's had one game. It's still fairly fresh, in my opinion.
Yeah.
You could argue that, a box standard shooter is a very tired mechanic, but, a lot of people still find enjoyment in that, right?
Yeah. No, it's true. And as I was saying that, I'm thinking like, yeah, right, Mr. Call of Duty hypocrite, you're just playing Modern Warfare. Not recently, though. I mean, I got really last big into it in like 2019, 2020. The reboot of the reboot of the reboot or whatever, it is. But I would argue that game was a pretty reasonable evolution of the Modern Warfare series, not necessarily its subsequent games, Vanguard and Modern Warfare 2, but the 2019 version was fairly like a fairly big reboot. But nonetheless, can you argue like some people would argue, well, a shooter's still a shooter at the end of the day? Is it really doing anything that different? Yeah.
Yeah. To a large extent, how fresh something feels just comes down to implementation and execution, not necessarily the core concept, right? Just like shooters can feel drastically different based on how they implement the same systems. Sorry, Lily, what were you saying?
Oh, sorry. Lily? Yeah, there's also something to be said there about like how many times you can use the same gaming formula, right? Like, sure, lots of people play bog standard shooters, but like Call of Duty, for example, how many people who played, the original Black Ops back in Mac Black Ops 24-hour Nuketown, still play Call of Duty now, like, and I know in every genre game, no matter where you go, like there are some people that'll be like, oh, it was at its peak in like World of Warcraft, for example. Like that's just an easy example. World of Warcraft was at its peak in Wrath of the Lich King. Was it really, or is that just when you got tired of it? Like, and there's something to be said there about like, yeah, the writing could have fallen off, the gameplay fell off, whatever. But like, me, I got into World of Warcraft, like really, really into it in Legion, which is like a newer expansion. A couple have come out since, but that was after having played ever since Burning Crusade. So I played through Burning Crusade, Wrath of the Lich King, all these expansions, and I was like, wow, Legion is the best expansion for me. And then the next expansion came out. I was just burnt out on the game, and I was like, wow, this expansion sucks. I'm done. And then, kind of looking back on it, yeah, the writing and the quality absolutely fell, but also part of it was just like I was kind of tired of playing the same game for so long, and I think there's this expectation of games that like, oh, this next one has to be new, right? But there's only so many ways you can introduce the same thing, right? Like sports games are a perfect example for this. It's like, why do people buy that sports games every year? It's just the same one, right? Like all you're seeing is names on the screen change. You're seeing some numbers on the jerseys change. Some jersey colors are changing. That's it. And it's like, people come in at different times. People join the game sphere per se in like 2020, and then 2023 rolls around, and all of a sudden just something clicks, and they're like, this isn't really fun anymore. And RPGs are no different. Like at the end of the day, D&D is it's really played the same way. It's the same stat blocks. You can rename them all you want. You can split up categories, whatever, but it is the same stats. It's the same skills. It's the same, even stories, right? Like you can take the same story cookie cutter, swap out some names, swap out some species, and it's going to be the same thing. And at the end of the day, it's really how much enjoyment you find from that. And that goes beyond the game itself as well, right? Like Knights of the Old Republic, for example, great game. Graphics are terrible. I'll still play it. It's still a fun game, and there's something that goes beyond the gameplay loop when you're finding enjoyment in games.
Well said.
I agree with that a lot. Just something that funny I thought of, because you brought up Knights of the Old Republic. BioWare sort of like went more and more away from the D&D systems as time went on in their gameplay design. Like, if I remember correctly, they made the original Baldur's Gate, didn't they?
Did they? Holy moly!
Think they did. I think they made the original Baldur's Gate games, and then Knights of the Old Republic was also based on a D&D system. I think it was 2nd edition or 3.5, one of the two. But then, like, the Mass Effect series went away from the D&D kind of system entirely. And then you have sort of the reverse evolution with Larian Studio that made games that didn't use a D&D-like system. But now they take ownership of Baldur's Gate and go into that system. Yeah.
That is interesting. But Lily made some fantastic points there, I think, that are really intelligent. Especially this idea of maybe when you enter or when you exit a game, let's call it an ecosystem or sphere. Because there are so many gaming, there's the RPG sphere and the shooter sphere and the RTS sphere, even though that's kind of on the down low these days. But it's, we'll see. They're making some new ones. The MMO sphere has, of course, been popular ever since forever, whether it's EverQuest and WoW and whatever, maybe some of their RuneScape and all that jazz, or going back to the MUDs. Aren't they called MUDs?
Yeah, the multi-user dungeons.
Yeah, those, so MMO sphere has kind of been around almost forever, so to speak, and it probably will be. The next big evolution of that will probably be VR ones that your Ready Player One type stuff, and yay many years. When you're onto something, I guess I was on a big turn-based whatever action RPG sort of spree, and I went around playing. I played what was it called? Vermin Shard, this little indie RPG where it's basically like Vermintide, but in like indie pixel form, but it's turn-based. So you're like, the rats have taken over the world, and you're just trying to make your way through and scavenge and live. I played that, and I played this very how you call it, like it's in the name. It's called Showgunners. It's like a game show, like, but to the death type thing, but it's all just turn-based combat, but with this sort of game show flair. So I just ran around playing, but all these games could be completed in like 5, 10, 12 hours, and I went around playing like 2, 3, 4 of these in a row. I was just really in the mood for them. And I was like, maybe I'll reinstall XCOM and get a bunch of mods going. And I'm like, okay, that's too much. I don't want to dump like 100 hours. I just wanted to play for like 10 or 12 or whatever. Sometimes you're just really in the mood for something. And sometimes you need a long break for something. I've never been an MMO guy, but I was pretty much always a MOBA guy ever since I got into them, back in 2009 or something. But I got to say, I kind of burned out around 2019, 2020, 10 years later. Countless games, zillions of hours. I'm like, I'm pretty up to the brim. Well, like I'm like drowning in this stuff. I kind of want to crawl out and take a breath somewhere else, And I don't really ever feel the interest to go back to playing them. Maybe games that are combos of them. There's even Overwatch is like a hybrid. They have stolen MOBA ideas. Arguably Rainbow Six Siege has, or even certain board games have. So kind of like ideas of it, but I don't really want to go and dive into that genre again. But
the champion-based shooters.
Yeah, paladins, what have you.
Yeah.
But I think certain genres, at least for me, are a little more timeless. I'll pretty much always enjoy a shooter, or at least maybe on and off. I'll pretty much always enjoy an RPG game, at least on and off, or turn-based like tactical type game. Maybe not literally forever, but like, oh, maybe I'll play a bunch this year and skip a year and play a bunch another time. And I'm sure all, serious gamers, or life gamers, whatever that is, people who game all the time, at least on computers and consoles. I don't know, the mobile realm. Like, maybe everyone has like a genre or two that's like their genre. Like they can always play it more or less. I suspect.
I feel like it always comes down to execution, because there's a lot of good games out there. There's a lot of mediocre games out there, and there's a lot of bad games out there. And it can cross any type of genre. And of course, you can burn out on a certain style for a bit, and you be more into one style or over another for a while. But when it all comes down to it, I think it's just execution more than what you're doing. Of course, again, preferences, but like I'd rather play Pathfinder, Kingmaker, and Wrath of the Righteous and Baldur's Gate 3 all after each other than intermingle with mediocre shooters, because all of these are high quality games and they execute their ideas well. And I think in the end, executing on an idea well matters more. Well, it matters a lot. I was almost going to say it matters more than what the idea is. Obviously, some ideas are just bad ideas, but like at least for like the traditional genres that have been proven to work, at least to some degree, it's all about execution. How well do you make it happen?
That's true. I would agree, because a really polished, really well executed game really draws you in. It's compelling. It's fun. It's engaging.
Yeah,
it could be single player, it could be multiplayer, but it's true. They stand out. So that's a good point as well. And I think, kind of like what Lily was saying, maybe, and like kind of experiencing some WoW burnout, even with the quality drop. But it could just be like, it's not like she doesn't enjoy RPGs. She plays Final Fantasy and other stuff, and she's played Divinity and this and that. So it's like, maybe you just need a really like smoothly, cleanly executed experience within a genre you enjoy to kind of be to be revitalized or regain your interest. And sometimes that could just mean an entirely different game.
And, well, with the WoW thing, so this is very much my opinion. My biggest problem with MMOs and stuff has always been that it's like one thing that you're expected to pour a bajillion hours into, and it almost wants to be like a job and a life in its own right and like control everything. It expects you to put so much time and effort into it that it's the only thing you do, almost, right? And at some point, I feel like variation is required. Like I can play 200, 300 hours of Pathfinder and be happy, but it will have a fixed end. There is like an end to the story, an end to the campaign, an end to the characters' levels and all that. But MMOs are often designed in such a way that they intend to go on forever. And I personally dislike that, and is part of why I don't like MMOs as much as so many other styles of games. It's a similar thing with like these TV shows that go on forever, where I'd much rather watch a movie or something than the Horton Saga or whatever that just has a bajillion episodes and never expects to finish. Right? I like finished narratives and experiences.
That's interesting. Lily, how do you feel about that as someone who does play a lot of MMOs and all kinds of games? What's sort of your thought on this sort of endless live service type game versus maybe ones that have more fixed endings?
I mean, it's definitely a struggle. Like, as someone who likes stories, likes telling stories, I definitely struggle to get into MMOs at first. MMOs especially, just a pet peeve of mine that they do all the time. It's just these lost storylines or like plots that are just dropped, right? Like World of Warcraft does this thing a lot where you go to a region, right? Like a leveling region, like, oh, you're level 10 to 20, go to the Ghostlands, right? And you play all these stories there and you meet all these characters, and then everything you do there just kind of vanishes, right? Like it has no effect on the world. It has like the characters just kind of disappear, and it's like it's got its shortfalls. I think one thing that made MMOs more bearable for me is kind of I'd be on role playing servers, so you can kind of write your own character. It's kind of like D&D in the MMO. Some people think it's incredibly nerdy, and they're like, "Oh, only losers go to RP servers," and like, you know. But those are the people that are just there for the gameplay loop. I feel, like, oh, I want to get to end game. I want to do the raids. I want to get the best gear, the best in slot stuff. And it's like, okay, that's fair. That's your jam. That's fine. But I'm a storyteller. I like telling stories. I like listening to stories. So, that was very much player interaction that made it for me. In that case, it's the same thing with Final Fantasy. Like, I play on a server that has a lot of player interaction into the role-playing part of the role-playing game. And a lot of people forget that, right? Like, you have MMO, but it's not just an MMO, it's an MMORPG. That's the full acronym, right? And a lot of people forget about the RP part of the MMORPG. And I think a lot of games have kind of fallen victim to themselves on that front. World of Warcraft especially is super guilty of doing that, where early on there was an emphasis on storytelling and how your character fit into it. Like, if you go back and play World of Warcraft Classic, there's a lot of little things that make it so that you stay with these characters for longer. You experience them over multiple areas, it's kind of gotten back to that recently, but it's very rushed. A lot of World of Warcraft stories are like, hey, the world's ending again, and then you go do a couple raids, and it's like, hey, you saved the world again, and it's like, you look back at World of Warcraft Classic, and it's just it's a lot more grounded. The story takes a lot longer to finish, and I don't know. There's a balance there. Some MMOs get it right, some don't, and some just have player interaction to buff it out. So I think it's definitely a weakness, and the endless nature of it makes it so that you can't really have a resolution unless you artificially dial it down, right? Like, it comes back down to that. It comes full circle, right? We started out with not having the human value, and here we are again. Having a human aspect to it can help ground the story, but I think a lot of MMOs with their inbuilt stories are making it so that the story never ends, and that's how they earn money. That's how they release expansions. That's their tactic. And it's clearly working for them because, people keep buying into it. People keep playing. But that attracts a certain kind of player. And I think if you're a story focused player, if you want a grounded RPG, MMOs are not the way to go. There are exceptions. You can find a good community, but then that's not really the game feeding you, right? That's other players feeding you. So that's wholly reliant on you finding a good community. And like anything with people, people can be stupid, people can be mean, people can just be incompetent. So, playing an MMO just to find story is not going to be the best of times.
It's actually kind of an interesting facet with the whole human contact thing here, because when we were talking earlier about, how these single player CRPGs compare to TTRPGs, tabletop role-playing games, one of the things we were talking about is how the lack of human interaction means you lose something in the storytelling, where the MMOs kind of have all these humans who you can interact with and have dynamism with, live interactions where people are able to react to literally everything you can think of because they're real people. But because there's so many of them and it's not really, part of the structure of things, all those players individually are less capable of influencing the path of the game. So even though you then have the human interaction, it matters less in a fixed gameplay storytelling kind of way. It can still matter a lot for the individual experience, of course, depending on how you enjoy it and who you find. But you gain that human interaction, but not in the same way again, even though it's there. Kind of an interesting back and forth between how it all works.
That is interesting. I never thought of that before, but that is funny. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. It's almost like too much of a good thing. I don't know what an average size for a D&D group is. I'm just going to go with like 4, but I know they could range from like 2 to 7 or 8 or whatever it is.
4 to 8 is very common range. But
4 to 8, right? So, well, once again, going with Critical Role because that's the only thing I've seen. I think it's 1 plus 6 or 7 on average. 1 being the DM. So on average, I think they are 7 people, and I feel like sometimes there's a little too much downtime for between things, but it's also, I don't mind it as a viewer, but if I was a player, I'd be annoyed, but I'm not a D&D player in a big group, so it doesn't matter. Yeah, the MMO thing's interesting. Also, the brief times I've played WoW, which is the only time I did level a Tauren to level 20 was so I could get a Paladin Hearthstone skin. But like some of that was like, I enjoyed the game more to like basically just messing with players, not in a bad way, but just like emoting and following them around or doing a few quests together. Like that was more interesting than this whole like save the universe narrative type thing. Like the human element to me was the most compelling part of the experience, but as Casper was just saying, it actually has a very limited effect on the overall game systems. That's more of like your individual interactions or experience. But it seemed fun. Or watching something like Grand Theft Auto Online RP servers, like on Twitch, pretty entertaining. When everyone's, Lily made a good point, some people are like dumb, mean, or incompetent. Assuming that's not there and everyone's like competently playing their role, it's pretty vastly entertaining. People just being taxi drivers and cops and robbers, and especially if they have a good improv. There's just some like ludicrous situations can arise that are very entertaining. So that's, but that's once again a very particular slice of the game, that the players have to create, more like TTRPG style almost. Yeah. But I think it's also, easily fails. It's very easy to poke holes in it. If like one of the quote unquote actors stumble in the scene, it can kind of pull the whole thing down, but it is what it is. But yeah, good food for thought on all sorts of RPGs, tabletop, MMOs, CRPGs, JRPGs.
And fortunately, a lot of the CRPG games exist on Mac.
They do, which is nice. Yeah, big shout out to Owlcat and Larian, who do Divinity and Baldur's Gate 3 now. Owlcat does Pathfinder, Kingmaker, Wrath of the Righteous. Now they're doing Rogue Trader. We need more quality 40K games out there. So from what I've seen, Rogue Trader is shaping up to be one. And especially based on the previous games, which I think are both rated very positive on Steam for Owlcat. Games Workshop's, let's just say they're a little too liberal with their licensing. And there's a lot of really mediocre or bad 40K games out there. But there are a lot of really good ones too. But I'm happy to do something especially with this narrative. I don't really think there's anything that narratively focused as far as I can game. There's tons of strategy games. I mean, the Dawn of War series has a decent narrative, but no one would call it like amazing.
Right.
It's solid. It's like not bad. It's not terrible. But it's also pretty bog standard for 40K. Oh no, there's a heretic traitor. Oh no, there's a chaos demon summon thing you have to beat up.
It's the same old, just another day in the Imperium of Man.
Yeah, pretty much. So that's why I'm really excited for Rogue Trader. I think both the setting, the character you're supposed to embody as a Rogue Trader and what they do, naturally kind of sidesteps a lot of that and gets you out there more in just kind of the nitty gritty of the society and of, the nobility and the poor and the good and the bad. And I think it has the possibility to be far more interesting, do something far more interesting with the lore and the setting than any other 40K game before it. So I'm very excited for it if I can get past its systems. Yeah. But yes, all good things for the Mac. Most major MMOs are there for Mac, of course. World of Warcraft's still on Mac. Final Fantasy, I believe, still has a Final Fantasy 14 or whatever it is. I think still has a Mac version.
So for Final Fantasy, it's only the MMO. The traditional style RPGs don't exist for a
Yeah.
Mac. However, so Game Porting Toolkit got an update to version 1.0.2 or 1.02, I think it's called. It's mildly improved performance, like 5 FPS on some Macs for some games. It improved which games run. Some games were broken because of cutscenes. That was basically fixed. And a weird move from Apple's side. They introduced 32-bit support to their wine compatibility layer, interestingly. But I recently checked out Final Fantasy VII Remake as well, and on my 16-inch M1 Max MacBook Pro, getting in the intro scene at least. I don't know if performance is worse outside, but 1080p, all high settings, I'm getting 60 to 80 FPS with the new update. So. You can run the Final Fantasy games through that, I guess, but the it's only the MMO that exists natively. Well, even that doesn't really run natively. It is actually, you can download it as if it were native and it'll like behave like a Mac app, but behind the scenes, it's actually running through a specialized crossover bottle made in collaboration with Code Weavers. So,
right, yeah, but fortunately, it's not too hard to be an RPG fan on the Mac overall. I mean, there's a couple MMOs out there you may want to play, and you may need to find a workaround. But as far as non-MMO RPGs, you have a pretty wide selection available. With pretty much all the major ones, even over the last several years, have been on Mac. Once again, not always right away, but it seems to be more common that they're developing. Baldur's Gate 3 had a Mac version quite early. Rogue Trader has a Mac version early in beta and stuff. So I'm hoping that trend continues because I think that's great.
Yeah, definitely.
More same day, not 6-12 months later or whatever. And then if you're the type of player who wants to hop in on a beta and kind of do some bug testing or a little feedback on the game, you can do that too, So that's always cool. Hopefully we'll see something more from the Game Porting Toolkit. For now, it's kind of a holding pattern, lots of possibilities and potential, but we don't really know where it'll go until time will tell. But yes, plenty of exciting. It's never really been bad to be an RPG gamer on the Mac, because even way back in the day, all the Baldur's Gates and Neverwinters and Icewind Dales, they all had Mac ports, and a bunch of other stuff in between. So good deal. All right, peeps, I think we can wrap it up here today, unless there's some other thought or comment someone wants to bring to the table.
No, I think it's a good time to end.
Already? Oh, okay. Well, we already did a soundbite, but I'll kind of do another and mishmash them together.
Yeah.
So, all right. That will wrap up episode 40. Yay, episode 40. A lot of fun. And the return of Lily. Yay, more fun.
Yay.
Woo. Yay.
For like a month, and then I go back into the field.
well, hopefully it can grab you for at least like one episode of your favorite games. And rattle through some of those, whatever many you want to do. So we'll look to do that soon. And so thanks for being here, everyone. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
It was nice being here. Bye, and we'll see you guys next time.
Bye.
Trivio.